Sure, here's a compelling and engaging introduction for your YouTube video story. The grocery store was buzzing with the usual evening rush. Shoppers scanning shelves, kids tugging at their parents, cashiers ringing up orders. No one expected what would happen next. Out of nowhere, the tense voice of a police officer cut through the noise. A female cop, her hand trembling slightly, had drawn her gun, pointing it straight at a man standing near the produce section. But this wasn't just any man. He was an Army veteran, a man who had served his country with honor. Witnesses say the officer looked panicked, her finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. The man, dressed in a simple green shirt and jeans, didn't move. He slowly raised his hands, his calm voice barely audible over the growing murmurs of the crowd. "Ma'am, I'm not a threat," he said. But the officer's eyes stayed locked on him, fear and authority clashing in her expression. People around them froze. Some instinctively raised their hands, others reached for their phones. The energy in the air was thick, suffocating. Why was this happening? What had this man done to deserve a gun in his face in the middle of a grocery store? And more importantly, would she pull the trigger? Then something shifted. A man in the crowd shouted, "He's a veteran. He's not dangerous." Another person echoed, "He served our country." It was as if the entire store had turned against the officer in that moment. The realization seemed to hit her all at once. She had made a terrible mistake. But it was already too late. The damage was done, and within hours, the shocking footage spread like wildfire across social media. People demanded answers, demanded justice. And justice came swiftly. The officer was fired on the spot. The department wasted no time distancing itself from the controversy, trying to calm the growing outrage. But the story didn't end there. Because karma has a way of catching up with people when they least expect it. And what happened to that officer next? Well, let's just say that life has a funny way of making people answer for their actions. The officer's termination made headlines, but the backlash didn't stop there. The video of her pointing a gun at an innocent Army veteran spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views overnight. People flooded social media with their reactions, some expressing outrage, others demanding deeper investigations into her past conduct. News anchors debated whether the firing was enough. Community leaders called for accountability. But one thing was clear. This incident had shaken people to their core. As for the Army veteran, his life changed instantly. One moment, he was just another man picking up groceries, and the next, he was at the center of a national conversation. Reporters showed up at his doorstep, asking for interviews. Friends and family reached out, worried about how he was handling the sudden attention. But through it all, he remained calm, just as he had in the store that day. "I faced real danger before," he told one journalist. "This wasn't it. But what scares me is knowing that if someone hadn't been filming, this might have ended differently." His words struck a nerve. People who had never met him felt his pain, his frustration. They saw him as more than just a victim. He was a reminder of how quickly things could escalate, how easily lives could be put at risk. Meanwhile, the fired officer disappeared from the public eye. No statements, no apologies, just silence. But behind closed doors, her world was unraveling. She had spent years in law enforcement, climbing the ranks, building a career she thought was secure. And now it was all gone in an instant. She tried to move forward, to put it behind her, but the internet never forgets. Every job application was met with hesitation. Every attempt to rebuild her life came with whispers, judgment, and rejection. But the real twist, the veteran wasn't done speaking out. He wanted more than just her firing. He wanted real change. He started attending community meetings, sharing his story, pushing for better training and accountability. And as he spoke, more people came forward, others who had faced similar situations but never got justice. It became clear that this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger, something deeper. And while the officer thought the worst was over, she had no idea what was coming next. Because karma doesn't just strike once. It has a way of making sure the lesson is learned. The tension didn't fade. If anything, it only grew stronger. The veteran story wasn't just another viral moment. It was a spark that ignited something bigger. Across the country, people debated what had happened, asking the same question. How could a trained officer make such a dangerous mistake? Some blamed fear, saying police were under pressure and often acted on instinct. Others argued that it was about more than just fear. It was about bias, about judgment, about who was seen as a threat and who wasn't. As the veteran continued to speak out, his words gained power. He wasn't just calling for justice for himself. He was calling for change in the system that had failed him. And the more he spoke, the more people listened. Activists reached out, inviting him to share his experience at events. Local leaders began discussing reforms. Even fellow veterans stepped forward, some sharing their own encounters with law enforcement, moments where their service hadn't shielded them from suspicion. Meanwhile, the fired officer struggled to move on. She tried to lay low, but the weight of what had happened followed her everywhere. Some of her former colleagues cut ties, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. Others defended her, saying she had simply reacted in the heat of the moment. But no matter where she turned, the same question haunted her. Had she let fear cloud her judgment? Then came the lawsuit. It wasn't filed by the veteran. He had made it clear from the start that he wasn't seeking personal revenge. But others saw an opportunity to push for accountability. A civil rights organization took up the case, arguing that the officer's actions had put an innocent man's life in danger, and that firing her wasn't enough. They wanted an investigation into how officers were trained, how they handled high-pressure situations, and whether policies needed to change. With the legal battle heating up, the story refused to fade from the headlines. News outlets kept revisiting the footage, analyzing every second, every movement. Experts debated whether the officer's actions were justified or reckless. The conversation grew more complicated, pulling in voices from law enforcement, veterans, and everyday people who saw themselves in the situation. And as all of this unfolded, the officer found herself in an unexpected position. She had once been the one holding the power, the one making decisions in a moment of crisis. Now she was the one being judged, the one facing consequences she never saw coming. But what she didn't know was that karma wasn't finished with her yet. The hardest part was still ahead. The pressure kept building, and there was no escape. The fired officer found herself drowning in the weight of her actions. No matter how hard she tried to disappear from the public eye, the story followed her. Her name was brought up in news reports, online discussions, and legal debates. Every time she thought things might quiet down, another article, another interview, another piece of evidence reignited the conversation. It was relentless. The lawsuit gained traction, and with it came new revelations. The officer's history was scrutinized. Had she been involved in similar incidents before? Were there complaints against her that had been buried? Investigators began digging, and what they uncovered only made things worse. Allegations surfaced, claims of past misconduct, reports of excessive force. Some were dismissed as minor, but others raised serious questions. Had she been protected by the system for too long? And now that she was no longer shielded by a badge, was the truth finally coming to light? At the same time, the veteran found himself in an unexpected position. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, but now he was a symbol for something bigger. He was invited to speak at rallies, asked to give interviews, and even approached by politicians looking to align themselves with his cause. But through it all, he remained focused on one thing: ensuring no one else had to experience what he had. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for others, for those whose voices had been ignored for too long. As the court date approached, the tension reached its peak. The officer had remained silent for months, but now she had no choice. She would have to testify. Would she admit she was wrong? Would she try to justify her actions? Or would she reveal something no one saw coming? And then, just when everyone thought they had seen it all, a new piece of evidence emerged. A different angle of the store footage, a moment that had been overlooked before. Experts analyzed it frame by frame, and what they found changed everything. The public braced themselves. This case had already exposed so much, but now the final truth was about to be revealed. The stage was set. The world was watching. And in just a matter of days, everything would come crashing down. Just when it seemed like the case had reached its boiling point, a shocking revelation changed everything. The newly uncovered footage wasn't just another angle. It exposed a detail no one had noticed before. The veteran wasn't alone in the aisle when the officer pulled her gun. A second officer had been there, standing just a few feet behind her, watching the entire situation unfold. And yet he had done nothing. He hadn't stepped in to de-escalate, hadn't tried to stop her. He had simply stood there silent. This revelation sent shockwaves through the case. Why hadn't this officer spoken up before? Was he afraid of the consequences? Or worse, had there been an unspoken understanding between them? Suddenly, the focus wasn't just on the fired cop. Investigators started looking into the second officer, questioning whether he had been involved in other incidents that had gone unnoticed. Internal reports surfaced, revealing a troubling pattern. Cases where he had been present during questionable arrests. Complaints that had been quietly dismissed. It wasn't just about one bad decision anymore. It was about a culture that allowed it to happen. As the courtroom filled with reporters and onlookers, the fired officer sat across from the veteran for the first time since that day. Her face was unreadable, but something in her posture suggested she was feeling the weight of it all. The silence in the room was heavy, the tension almost unbearable. The prosecutor wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "Officer, at any point, did you truly believe your life was in danger?" The question hung in the air. The officer hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, waiting for updates. Supporters of the veteran held signs demanding justice. Others defended the officer, arguing that she had made a mistake, but didn't deserve to have her entire life ruined. The divide was growing deeper, the stakes higher. But then something no one expected happened. A former colleague of the officer came forward with a confession, one that would turn the entire case upside down. She had known the officer for years, had trained alongside her, and what she revealed sent shockwaves through the case. This wasn't the first time the officer had drawn her gun on someone who wasn't a threat. There had been other cases that had been quietly swept under the rug. But this time, with the whole world watching, there was no hiding. And as the courtroom prepared for the final days of the trial, one thing became clear: this story was far from over. As the final days of the trial unfolded, the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and people from all walks of life who had followed every twist and turn of this case. The fired officer sat stiffly at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly together. Across from her, the veteran remained composed, his steady presence a reminder of the strength that had carried him through this ordeal. But what no one expected was how quickly everything would unravel in the final moments. The prosecution presented their final piece of evidence, records proving that the officer had been involved in multiple past incidents, where she had drawn her weapon without justification. Complaints had been filed, but somehow she had always managed to walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Her department had protected her, covered for her, and now all of it was coming to light. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and for the first time since the trial began, the officer looked shaken. She had been so sure she could get through this, that she could explain away her actions. But now the truth was out for everyone to see. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to give the verdict. The air was thick with anticipation. Then the words came, "Guilty of reckless endangerment." Gasps echoed through the room. Some nodded in approval, others whispered in shock. The sentence was lighter than some had hoped, but it was still a clear message. This time, there were consequences. The officer sat frozen, as if the reality of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in. But just as people thought the story was reaching its end, a final twist changed everything. As the officer was being escorted out, a man stood up from the back of the courtroom. His face was one that few recognized, but his words sent chills through the room. He was a retired police officer, someone who had worked with her years ago. And what he revealed was the missing piece of the puzzle. He had witnessed firsthand how the officer had been trained, how she had been taught to react in high-pressure situations. And the truth? She wasn't the only one. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about a system that had shaped her into who she became. And if nothing changed, there would be more cases like this, more lives put at risk. The real question wasn't just about what would happen to her. It was about whether the system itself would ever be held accountable. And as the veteran stepped outside to face the cameras, he knew his fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with emotion. Supporters of the veteran cheered, some hugging one another, others wiping away tears. News reporters scrambled to get reactions. Microphones and cameras pointed in every direction. But despite the crowd, the veteran stood still for a moment, taking it all in. It wasn't just about him anymore. His case had started a conversation that couldn't be ignored. The fired officer, now convicted, was escorted past the press, her expression unreadable. There was no victory in her eyes, no defiance, just exhaustion. For the first time, she seemed to truly realize the weight of her actions. But the biggest question still lingered. Would this case actually lead to real change, or would it be just another moment in the news cycle, forgotten when the next controversy arrived? As weeks passed, discussions about police training and accountability grew louder. Departments across the country were being pushed to review their policies, activists demanded reform, and lawmakers debated new measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. Some argued that one officer's conviction wasn't enough, that the system itself needed to be dismantled and rebuilt. Others saw it as a step in the right direction, proof that accountability was possible. The veteran, though relieved that justice had been served, knew that his journey wasn't over. He had been thrust into the spotlight, and people looked to him for guidance. So he used his voice. He spoke at forums, met with leaders, and continued sharing his experience. His story became part of a larger movement, one that stretched beyond him, beyond this one courtroom, reaching those who had felt unheard for far too long. Months later, as he walked through his neighborhood, life had returned to a quiet kind of normal. He still got stopped by strangers who recognized him, thanking him for his strength. Some asked if he would ever fully forgive the officer. He didn't have an answer for that. What he knew for certain was that he had survived, that he had stood his ground, and that because of him, something had shifted. As for the officer, her future remained uncertain. The system that once protected her had turned its back, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Whether she learned from it, whether she truly understood the impact of her actions, was something only time would tell. But one thing was clear: the world had watched, listened, and changed. And no matter what came next, the truth of what happened that day in the grocery store would never be erased.